You think I wouldn't find out what you've been telling people about us. Your sister showed me the messages from the neighbor. You've been making our family look like we don't care about each other. I built this family's name in this town, and I won't let you destroy it with your selfish stories. Give me the journal you found. It doesn't belong to you. If you don't stop trying to turn everyone against me, you'll lose the only family you have left. Hi, my name is Emily Sullivan. I am 30 years old. That afternoon, the door to my third grade classroom opened without a knock. My mother stood there in her pressed slacks and cardigan, the same ones she wore to every town council meeting, and my sister stood half a step behind her like she always did. The last bell had rung 20 minutes earlier. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of a custodian's cart. I was erasing the whiteboard when my mother spoke those first words, and the marker slipped from my fingers and rolled under a desk. I had spent the last 6 years teaching in this small Missouri town because it was close enough to the family property that weekend visits had once felt easy and natural. My mother had always said the family needed to keep the stories straight for the neighbors and the historical society. I used to think that meant preserving old photographs and recipes. I did not understand until that day how tightly she controlled which stories were allowed to exist at all. My sister had been the one who called earlier that week, her voice light, almost casual, asking if I had accidentally taken the old photo album from the hallway closet during my last visit. I told her I had not. She laughed and said Mom was just being protective of the family legacy. 2 days later, the neighbor, Mrs. Klein, stopped me at the grocery store and said she was sorry to hear I was struggling so much and making up stories for attention. When I asked what she meant, she looked uncomfortable and said my mother had mentioned it at the library board meeting. I went home that night and pulled the dusty cardboard box from the back of my closet. Inside were the spiral-bound journals my grandmother had kept for decades. I had found them 2 months earlier while helping clean out the attic after my grandmother's passing. One page, dated almost 20 years ago, described how my mother had quietly convinced the rest of the family that a cousin who asked too many questions about money was unstable and needed distance. The cousin stopped coming to holidays. No one ever spoke her name again. I had not planned to confront anyone. I had only wanted to understand why certain relatives had drifted away over the years. But when my mother and sister appeared in my classroom, I realized the controlled stories had reached me at last. My mother stepped further into the room and lowered her voice even though no one else was there. Your sister told me you've been talking to neighbors about private family matters. That stops today. My sister crossed her arms and added, Mom has worked too hard to keep this family respected in town. You don't get to rewrite everything just because you're bored with your own life. I felt the words land like small, precise cuts. I had spent years being the one who organized the annual family picnic, who remembered birthdays, who drove 2 hours to help when someone was sick. I had never asked for credit. I had only started pulling back when I noticed that every time I shared a memory that did not match the polished version my mother preferred, the phone calls from other relatives grew cooler. My mother held out her hand. The journal. Now. I did not move. The classroom suddenly felt too small, the smell of dry erase marker and floor wax too sharp. I thought about the page I had read the night before, the one where my grandmother wrote that she had stayed silent for decades because speaking up had cost her a sister. I thought about how many times I had swallowed my own questions to keep the peace. I'm not giving you anything, I said quietly, and I'm not apologizing for asking questions. My mother's mouth tightened. My sister's expression shifted into something almost pitying. They left without another word, but the door clicked shut with a finality that echoed long after they were gone. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the journals spread open. Page after page showed the same pattern, my mother shaping the family narrative, my sister reinforcing it, relatives who stepped out of line quietly removed from the story. I had spent 30 years believing that being the reliable daughter, the one who gave without complaint, would eventually earn me a place inside that story. The journals showed I had only ever been useful as long as I stayed quiet. The next morning at school, Mr. Ellis, the principal, called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable. "Your mother phoned last night. She's concerned about your stress levels. She suggested we keep an eye on how you're handling things with the students." I stared at him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I had never missed a day, never raised my voice in class, never let a single parent complaint reach his desk. The only thing that had changed was that I had stopped pretending the family stories were perfect. I went back to my classroom and stared at the empty desks. For the first time in years, I let myself feel the full weight of what had been happening. My mother had not needed to scream or threaten. She had simply rewritten reality one conversation at a time, and my sister had helped her do it. Relatives I once called aunts and uncles now crossed the street when they saw me in town. Weekend visits that used to happen without planning had stopped. No one had said why. They did not need to. The story had already been written without me in it. I drove to the family property that weekend. Anyway, even though no one had invited me. The old farmhouse sat quiet under the late afternoon light. My mother's car was in the driveway. My sister's car was parked beside it. I sat in my own car for 20 minutes before I turned the key and drove back to my apartment. That night, I opened the journal again and read the final entry my grandmother had written before she stopped keeping records. It was short. "Some stories are kept alive only by the people willing to be erased inside them. I am tired of being erased." I closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside the others. For the first time, I understood that protecting the peace my mother demanded had cost me pieces of myself I could not get back. I also understood that continuing to give, to organize, to stay silent, would only buy me more of the same quiet removal. The phone rang. It was my sister. Her voice was careful, almost gentle. "Mom is upset. She says if you can't respect the family, maybe it's better if you don't come around for a while. Just until things settle." I did not answer. I ended the call and turned the phone face down on the table. Outside, the street was dark and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped. I sat in the stillness and let the truth settle where the controlled stories used to live. The call with my sister ended when I set the phone down without a word. I sat at the kitchen table long after the screen went dark, the weight of her calm suggestion pressing harder than any shout could have. My mother had decided distance was the solution. My sister had delivered the message without hesitation. Neither of them had asked what I actually needed. The next morning, Mr. Ellis asked to see me before the first bell. He closed his office door and folded his hands on the desk the way he did when a parent complained. "Your mother called again last night," he said. "She's worried the stress of the school year is affecting your judgment. She mentioned some confusion about family matters and thought it might be helpful if I checked in." I kept my voice even. "Did she say what confusion she meant?" He shifted in his chair. "She said you've been sharing private things with neighbors and that it's upsetting the family. Emily, I don't want to get involved in personal business, but if there's anything going on at home that could impact your classroom, I need to know." The words landed cleanly. My mother had not accused me of anything specific. She had simply planted the idea that I was unreliable, and now my principal was repeating it back to me as concern. I told him there was nothing affecting my teaching. He nodded, but the look in his eyes had changed. The seed was already growing. After the last student left that afternoon, I drove to the library on the edge of town. Sophie Ramirez was finishing her shift at the reference desk. We had known each other since high school, the kind of friend who remembered the versions of me I'd almost forgotten. She took one look at my face and suggested we walk to the small cafe across the street. We sat at a corner table. Sophie stirred her coffee slowly. Mrs. Klein was in here yesterday, she said. She asked if you were doing all right. Said your mother told the library board you've been rewriting family history for attention, and that people should be careful what they believe. I felt the air leave my lungs in one quiet rush. My mother had not stopped at the school. She had taken the story to the one place in town where information moved fastest. Sophie reached across the table and touched my wrist. I told her your mother has always had strong opinions about how things should look, but Emily, this feels different. It feels like she's trying to make sure no one listens to you. I told Sophie about the journals. I told her about the page where my grandmother described my mother convincing everyone that a cousin who asked questions was unstable. Sophie listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. What are you going to do? I did not have an answer yet. I only knew that every person I had trusted with the family's polished version was now hearing a different story, one in which I was the problem. That evening, I called my cousin Brian Harper. He had always been the one who showed up without being asked, the one who still sent the occasional text about a new fishing spot or a memory from when we were kids. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Hey," he said, and the single word already sounded careful. I asked if he had time to talk. He said he was heading out the door, but could listen for a minute. I told him about the journals and the things my mother and sister had said at the school. I asked if anyone in the family had mentioned anything strange lately. There was a pause. "Aunt Carolyn called a couple days ago," he said finally. "She said you've been under a lot of pressure and that you might be saying things that aren't accurate because you're overwhelmed. She asked me to give you space so you could focus on getting steady again." The line stayed quiet between us. I could hear a television in the background at his house, the ordinary sound of someone else's evening. Brian cleared his throat. "Look, I don't want to take sides. Maybe just let things cool off for a bit." I thanked him and ended the call. My hands were steady when I set the phone down, but something inside my chest had gone still in a way that felt final. Even the cousin who once drove across the state for spontaneous weekends now believed the version my mother had written. I opened the journals again that night. Most of the pages were filled with careful handwriting about weather and recipes and who had visited. But near the back, tucked between 2 folded sheets, I found loose pages I had not noticed before. They were dated from the year I turned 12. My grandmother had written about a family argument. I barely remembered one where an aunt had questioned how money from a small property sale had been divided. My mother had told everyone the aunt was confused and bitter. The aunt stopped coming to holidays. 2 years later, she moved out of state and never returned. The pages felt heavier than paper should. I read them twice. The pattern was not new. It had simply never included me until now. The next morning, another call came, this time from my Aunt Margaret. She had always been the quiet one at gatherings, the one who brought extra pies and rarely argued. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Emily, your mother is very concerned. She says you've been taking things from the house and telling stories that hurt people. I think it would be better if you stayed away from family events until you've had a chance to talk with someone." I asked who she thought I should talk with. She hesitated. Your mother mentioned a counselor she knows. Someone who understands family pressure." I did not argue. I thanked her for calling and set the phone down. The list of people who would no longer answer without first checking with my mother was growing. The spontaneous visits, the unannounced stops by the house, the casual texts that once filled ordinary days, all of it was being quietly withdrawn. That afternoon, I sat in my classroom after the students left and spread the loose journal pages across a desk. The handwriting was smaller on these sheets, as if my grandmother had been afraid someone might read them. One line stood out. "She does not need to raise her voice. She only needs everyone to believe the story she tells first." I folded the pages and slid them into my bag. I had spent years giving my mother the benefit of every doubt, because she was the one who kept the family together on the surface. I had believed that staying quiet was the same as keeping peace. The pages in my bag proved otherwise. The peace had always belonged to the person who controlled the story. I drove home through the quiet streets of town. The lights in the windows looked ordinary. Families were sitting down to dinner, children were doing homework. No one outside my own blood knew that the version of me they had been given was already being rewritten. When I reached my apartment, the phone lit up with a text from my sister. It was short. Mom says the family gathering next month is going to be small this year. She thinks it's better if you sit this one out so things don't get tense. I read the message twice. The annual gathering had never been small. It had been the one fixed point on the calendar where everyone showed up without needing an invitation. Now even that was being closed to me, presented as a kindness. I set the phone down and looked at the bag containing the journal pages. The evidence of years of careful removal was inside it. My mother and sister had not needed to shout or threaten. They had simply continued the pattern my grandmother had written about decades earlier, and this time the person being written out of the story was me. I stood in the middle of my living room and felt the first true fracture open inside my chest. The people I had spent 30 years showing up for had decided without asking me that I no longer belonged in the room. The decision had already been made. The only question left was whether I would keep knocking on a door that had been locked from the inside. The text from my sister about the family gathering sat on my phone like a final signature on a document I had never signed. I read it once more, then placed the phone face down. The journal pages were still in my bag. I had spent years showing up, organizing, remembering, giving, the parts of myself that kept the surface of our family smooth. That had never been enough. Now even the annual gathering, the one place where no invitation was required, was being closed to me under the guise of keeping things calm. I drove to the family property the next evening without calling first. The small farmhouse sat back from the road, the way it always had lights on in the kitchen. My mother's car and my sister's car were both in the driveway. I parked behind them and walked to the back door the way I had done hundreds of times before. This time I knocked. My mother opened the door. She did not look surprised. "Emily, we weren't expecting you." My sister appeared behind her in the hallway, arms crossed. "This isn't a good time. We're in the middle of planning." I stepped inside anyway. The kitchen smelled like the coffee my mother always made too strong. I set my bag on the table and took out the loose journal pages. I found these in grandmother's things. I think we should talk about them. My mother's expression did not change. She poured herself a cup of coffee as if I had brought a grocery list. "Your grandmother wrote a lot of things when she was older. She wasn't always clear." I read the page aloud anyway. The one about the aunt who asked questions and was labeled confused and bitter until she stopped coming. My sister shifted her weight but stayed silent. My mother set her cup down with deliberate care. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Families have disagreements, or you're making something ordinary into a crisis because you're looking for attention." The words were delivered without heat, the same way she had always corrected me when I was small. I felt the old reflex to apologize rise and then die. I turned to the next page, the one where my grandmother described how my mother had taken credit for stories that belonged to other people and shared them with the Historical Society as her own. My mother's hand moved before I could stop her. She reached across the table and tried to take the pages. I pulled them back. For the first time, her voice sharpened. "Those are not yours to decide who sees. I have spent my entire life protecting this family's reputation in this town. You do not get to come in here and tear it apart because you found some old scribbles." My sister finally spoke. "Mom's right. You've always been dramatic when you don't get your way. First the neighbors. Now this. What do you even want from us?" I looked at her. "I want the truth to stop being optional. I want to stop being written out of stories I helped carry." My mother laughed once, a short, dry sound. "The truth. You think those pages are the truth? Your grandmother was lonely and bitter at the end? She wrote what made her feel important, just like you're doing now." The old document surfaced, then tucked between two of the journal pages I had not unfolded yet. It was a letter from my grandmother to my mother, dated the year I turned 16. In it, she wrote that she had watched my mother slowly claim every family memory as her own, sharing them with Mrs. Thornton at the Historical Society and letting people believe she was the sole keeper of our history. She warned that one day someone would notice the erasures. The letter ended with a line I had to read twice: "If you keep removing the people who remember differently, eventually no one will remember you either." I placed the letter on the table between us. My mother stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, folded it once, and slid it into her pocket. "That letter was never meant for you," she said quietly. "Your grandmother was dying and confused. I kept it because I didn't want anyone else to be hurt by her state of mind." My sister stepped closer to her. "You should leave now, Emily, before this gets worse." I felt the choice arrive with perfect clarity. I could keep knocking, keep presenting evidence, keep hoping that the people who had raised me would choose the truth over the version they had built. Or I could stop. I could accept that the family I had been loyal to did not exist in the form I had loved. The spontaneous weekend visits were already gone. The unannounced stops, the casual texts, the automatic inclusion in plans, all of it had been withdrawn, one quiet conversation at a time. Staying would only mean fighting for a seat at a table where my presence had already been decided against. I picked up the remaining journal pages and put them back in my bag. "I'm not coming to the gathering," I said, "and I won't be calling to check in. If either of you wants to talk about what actually happened instead of what makes the family look good, you know where I am, but I won't be the one carrying the story anymore." My mother did not answer. My sister looked away. I walked out the back door and closed it behind me. The sound was ordinary, the same sound it had always made. This time it felt like the end of something that had already been ending for years. I drove halfway back to my apartment before I had to pull over. The breakdown came without warning, the way grief does when it has been held at arm's length for too long. I sat in the car on the side of the road with my hands gripping the steering wheel and let the sound come out of me raw and unmeasured. I cried for the version of my mother I had defended for decades. I cried for my sister, who had chosen the safety of the story over the person sitting across from her. I cried for every relative who would now hear that I had become difficult and unstable and would believe it because the person telling them had never been questioned. I cried for the loss of the easy belonging I had taken for granted, the kind that let you show up without explaining yourself. When the worst of it passed, I sat in the quiet car and felt the emptiness that remained. It was not the clean emptiness of relief. It was the hollow space where a lifetime of effort had lived. I had given time, energy, loyalty, and the benefit of every doubt. None of it had protected me from being removed the moment I stopped being convenient. I started the car again and drove the rest of the way home. The apartment was dark when I unlocked the door. I turned on one lamp and sat on the couch with the journal pages in my lap. The words my grandmother had written decades earlier now belonged to me in a way they never had before. She had seen the pattern and stayed silent to keep a kind of peace. I had seen it and chosen to name it. Neither choice had saved the family we both wanted, but only one of us had stopped erasing ourselves to protect it. In the weeks that followed, the calls stopped completely. No one from the family reached out. The annual gathering happened without me, and I did not hear about it afterward. Mrs. Thornton from the Historical Society continued to post family stories on the town page, always credited to my mother and my sister. The version of our history that existed in town remained polished and incomplete. I did not correct it. Correcting it would have required staying inside a conversation that had already decided I was the problem. Sophie Ramirez came over one evening with takeout and did not ask me to explain what had happened. She simply sat with me while I sorted through boxes of old photographs I had kept separate from the family albums. We set aside the ones that felt like mine and put the rest away. It was not dramatic. It was only the slow, ordinary work of deciding what belonged to me, now that I was no longer required to carry the rest. I still teach third grade. Mr. Ellis stopped asking careful questions after I told him my family matters were private and would not affect my classroom. Mrs. Klein still nods when she sees me at the store, but the conversations are shorter. Brian Harper sent one text 2 months later saying he hoped I was doing okay. I answered that I was. I did not ask about anyone else. The spontaneous weekend visits never returned. No one showed up unannounced. No one called to say they were thinking of me and wondered if I had time. The absence became its own kind of clarity. I had spent 30 years believing that being the one who gave without limits would eventually make me safe inside the family. It had only made me useful until I was not. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the last of the loose journal pages. I read the line my grandmother had written about stories being kept alive only by the people willing to be erased inside them. I folded the page and placed it in a small wooden box I had bought for that purpose. Then I closed the box and put it on the shelf beside the others. I had lost the family I thought I had. I'd also stopped disappearing inside their version of me. The peace I had protected for so long had never been mine to keep. The peace I was learning to protect now belonged only to me. It was smaller than I had imagined it would be. It was also mine in a way nothing else had ever been. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, type boundaries in the comments and tell me what you would have done when the gathering invitation was quietly taken away.